This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Love this podcast? Support this show through the Acast supporter feature. It's up to you how much you give, and there's no regular commitment. Just hit the link in the show description to support now.
Selling a little or a lot? Shopify helps you do your thing however you cha-ching. Shopify is the global commerce platform that helps you sell at every stage of your business. From the launch your online shop stage to the first real-life store stage, all the way to the did we just hit a million orders stage. Shopify is there to help you grow. Shopify helps you turn browsers into buyers with the internet's best converting checkout. 36% better on average compared to other leading commerce platforms. Because businesses that grow, grow with Shopify. Get a $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/work. Shopify.com/work.
Hey, it's Mark Marin from WTF here to let you know that this podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. And I'm sure the reason you're listening to this podcast right now is because you chose it. Well, choose Progressive's Name Your Price tool, and you could find insurance options that fit your budget, so you can pick the best one for your situation. Who doesn't like choice? Try it at Progressive.com. And now, some legal info. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
Need a holiday gift that will keep her sparkling all year long? Blue Nile, the original online jeweler, has experts on hand 24/7 who can help you find the perfect piece. Beyond that, Blue Nile makes the gifting experience easier than ever with guaranteed free shipping and returns, as well as a wide assortment of jewelry of the highest quality at the best price. Right now, get 30% off jewelry at BlueNile.com. That's BlueNile.com for 30% off. BlueNile.com.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello everybody and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale. I'm a writer and film critic, and today I'm talking to Warren Buckland, who is an academic and writer, and he has written a book which will be published in the autumn about the author controversy concerning Citizen Kane between Herman Mankiewicz and Orson Welles, who wrote Citizen Kane, and we're going to get into it with detailed analysis. If you enjoy the conversation, please remember to like, review, and spread the word as far and wide as you can. There are lots of episodes available now, over 100 episodes available now. So if you have not been with us since the beginning, as many of you have not, then feel free to go back and fish out some of the older episodes, which I will be sort of updating occasionally and putting and reposting as time passes, especially over the summer, as there are lots of festivals to attend, and so it makes releasing new episodes a little bit bumpy to schedule. Can I also put a quick shout out for Cinema Italia, my other podcast, which is going out on a weekly basis. Here we talk about films from the Italian scene, from spaghetti westerns, gialli, epics to neorealism, with enthusiasts, film fans, film critics, directors, and actors. So you can find that if you just Google my name and Cinema Italia. You can find it on all the podcast platforms, popular podcast platforms, I dare to say, Spotify, Amazon, Audible, YouTube, and Apple Podcasts, of course. Okay, but before you do any of that, I've given you way too much to do, haven't I? Before you do any of that, please enjoy the conversation.
I studied my PhD at University of East Anglia, supervised by Thomas Elsasso. In fact, halfway through, he actually moved to Amsterdam, and I had a choice to stay in Norwich or to spend my final year in Amsterdam. So I obviously did the latter. So I thought that was be a bit more exciting. So while Thomas Elsasser was setting up film studies in University of Amsterdam in the mid 1990s, I was there as well, finishing my PhD thesis. And going to Amsterdam, opened up a whole vista of, new colleagues. And, I started teaching with Thomas on the MA there. And after several years of teaching on the MA, we began to put our notes together into a book. And that became the book, Studying Contemporary American Film, a Guide to Movie Analysis. So we spent several years teaching that stuff to MA students, and then it came out as a book, which was halfway between a textbook and a research monograph, and it did quite well. The publisher wanted us to do a second edition, to change all the films, but that would have been a huge effort. So we said, well, the theory would stay the same, so we might as well, we couldn't really invest the time in doing that. Yeah, I was just saying, out of that really came this idea of the puzzle film, which again that came out of that seminar, but when we were studying contemporary cinema and trying to distinguish puzzle films from other types of films, Thomas developed his own concept of the mind game film. So we had these parallel developments at the same time. We sort of had this sort of playful critique of each other, because he thought my notion of puzzle film was far too narrow, and and he had a notion of mind game film which was far broader. Basically, I was just interested in these films from a narratological perspective, and he had a much broader agenda, more cultural, philosophical, historical agenda that he continued to develop for the next 20 years, and I basically just stuck to narrative theory of these films. It really emerged from watching David Lynch films, like Lost Highway was really the film that did it for me. Watching Lost Highway several times in midnight screenings in Amsterdam, it is pretty remarkable. Going to the films with all these fans to watch Lost Highway, and then trying to figure out what the film means. And of course I always said, well, it's not what it means, it's how it means. And we need to study how, if the film is ambiguous, then we need to study how it is ambiguous rather than try to shut down the ambiguity and fix it. So we need to acknowledge the ambiguity. So that was really the beginnings of that interest in puzzle films. So, all developed out of that late 90s interest, and just being in Amsterdam with Thomas Elsasser. It was a very creative period for me, very formative.
What was the distinction then between what you were defining as puzzle films and he was defining as mind game films?
For me, well, he interpreted the term puzzle as being you can solve it, you can solve the film.
There's an answer.
Yeah, and I never actually meant it in that way, but nonetheless, that was the way Thomas read it, and he, one of his main issues about the mind game film is that it's irresolvable, and you have to acknowledge that there are these fundamental contradictions that you cannot resolve. And for him, the mind game film actually acknowledges that, rather than offering, you can even use Claude Lévi-Strauss and say, the puzzle films and mind game films do not offer imaginary solutions to real contradictions. You become aware of those real contradictions.
So you're not going to give me the answer to Lost Highway then?
No, I think those who say they tell you what it means, they're just actually missing, half the film, because as soon as you try to disambiguate it, then you're missing the point. So.
Yeah, David Chase has a similar opinion about the ending of Sopranos. You know, if you think you know the answer, it's you've missed the point entirely.
Yeah.
And yeah, I don't know. There's a little bit of me that sort of I think there are some films which sort of look like puzzle films in that definition, but they do have an answer, in the sense that, like, something like Christopher Nolan's Inception, I think it's very clear that there is a very distinct and specific answer, and he's using a sort of editing device, i.e., he's cutting before what would be revealing happens, just in order to maintain a sense of ambiguity, rather than because there's any genuine ambiguity.
Well, if you have a $200 million budget, then you have to offer some solution to the audience. I guess that's the problem when the mind game film or puzzle film elements then enter the mainstream. Then obviously they're compromised. You know, David Lynch obviously didn't compromise with Lost Highway, or indeed with Mulholland Drive, but Christopher Nolan is sort of using them within a more traditional narrative structure. You know, you could be Hush.
Just to push back a little bit on that, I mean, I'm no, I think I have certain problems with Nolan, definitely, but I mean, if anything, things like Dunkirk and Tenet, he seems to be constantly spending a lot of money on plots which are sort of bafflingly complex in his, I mean, unnecessary. I mean, Dunkirk could easily have just been a fairly straightforward war film, and he chose not to do that. So I'm not sure how much he's compromising there.
Yeah, I think Tenet, he didn't compromise.
Yeah.
I think it's people just say it's baffling, but then that with this large budget, and I think that's part of its strength, actually, that he actually went ahead with it. Yeah, I think some people say it's, they criticize it, and I think it's if they do, then I think it's an underrated film. Much more challenging and complex than Inception. So I'd much prefer Tenet to Inception in that sense.
Yeah, and so now you're working on this new book, which you've finished this new book, which is on the authorship. I mean, this is a different kind of puzzle in a way. The authorship of Citizen Kane, which has been argued about for decades, and recently re-emerged with the film Mank by David Fincher, written by his father. That rehearsed some of the arguments for believing that Mankiewicz, Herman Mankiewicz, is that right?
Yeah,
was more the author than Orson Welles had let on. So what's your approach?
Well, I guess I should point out what I'm trying to avoid. Firstly, all the debates around Citizen Kane authorship, they're completely subjective. They're impressionistic. They're based on confirmation bias. It's people saying, "Well, I knew Wells, therefore I know the truth of this," which clearly isn't. If it was a court case, it wouldn't stand up in court. Just saying, "Well, I know this person did it." You need independent evidence.
Yeah, assertion is not argument.
Yeah. After reading all of these accounts of the to and fro between various people and their critiques of each other, I thought, well, we can take this to a completely different level and look at it in terms of the evidence that we do have, which are the various versions of the screenplay, and then use statistics to measure and quantify the authorship, because that is possible. You can go all the way back to Aristotle, who said, he defined style in terms of the writer's identity, and says, the writer can claim a piece of text because as part of their identity exists within the text, so they can claim it. And ever since then, it's, we've been defining style. And the issue is we really need evidence for, measuring style. These are the two things, the measuring the style and quantifying it. And then when you've got a dispute between two authors, you can then compare them in terms of the style that has been quantified. So once you've reduced it to a numerical value, you can make comparisons. So rather than just making assertions.
So how do you reduce style to a numerical value?
Yeah, that is part of the complex part of the book, but I try to go through it as simply as I can. Okay, so as I said, the key is then quantifying linguistic features of style. And, the basic way of quantifying style is to count the frequency of linguistic features, letters, words, different word types, pronouns, and even punctuation. Punctuation is actually quite important when you're defining authorship. If you have two authors like Wells and Mankiewicz, you can identify these particular linguistic features that have a high frequency in one author and a low frequency in the other author. So those are the linguistic features that we're looking for. So so these are called distinctive linguistic features because their frequencies are different in both authors. Now, obviously, you can use statistics to then measure that difference because some differences are significant and some are not significant, but I can get onto that later. To identify the author's style, then I needed a control group. So I managed to collect 40,000 word samples from each author's other screenplays. Then use software to generate the frequency of all linguistic features, from letters, punctuation, words, and two-word collocations. I did this systematically. I just focused on, letters first of all, looked at all the differences, and then moved on to words. This took several weeks. So you generate these huge lists of features and their relative frequency. The relative frequency simply means the frequency of this feature in relation to the whole data set. So it's 40,000 word sample, and then you just count a particular word and divide the word into that 40,000 word sample, then you get the relative frequency. So I did this for both authors, just compared them, and I eventually identified 44 linguistic features that have a high frequency in one author and a very low frequency in the other author. So that's the statistical profile of each author. And, it's very mundane. It's words like day and the and full stop, things like that. But you have no idea what you're going to come up with. It really is a process of discovery of seeing what distinguishes Wells from Mankiewicz. So I eventually got these linguistic profiles, so these 44 words that have high frequency in Wells and low frequency in Mankiewicz, and actually the other way around. It gets quite complicated because that's not the same. But once you've got that profile, I then compared it to the frequency of those 44 linguistic features. I then looked for those features in the Citizen Kane screenplay, and then counted, their frequency, and then compared it to the frequency in Wells and their frequency in Mankiewicz. And I did that 3 times. So I just compared their profiles to the whole screenplay of Citizen Kane. I then divided into 4,000 word segments. So I ended up with 7 segments. And then the film is divided into 13 major scenes. So I then compared the profiles to the 13 major scenes, which again generates huge amounts of data. Now, a lot of procedural issues here. I can actually give you an example. We may lose everybody.
No, go ahead. This is interesting. So,
because the way I've described it, you can raise a lot of objections.
Sure.
But I was aware of all of the issues and problems involved. So this is why it took a long time. I then made sure that I didn't fall into the usual traps. So let me give an example of the word that is very distinctive, and it's the word day. Okay, I'll begin with the end result. The word day has a distinctive ratio of 3.41, which basically means Mankiewicz uses it 3.41 times more than Wells does.
Right.
Okay. And if we look at the numbers in the 40,000 word sample for Mankiewicz, he uses the word day 79 times. Orson Welles, in his 40,000 word sample, uses the word day 23 times. Now, okay, those are raw figures, but because the data sets are the same size, we can make a direct comparison there. But obviously, Citizen Kane is a different sample size. It's 26,000 words, basically. So to compare different sample sizes, you simply convert them to a percentage. So this is why we use percentages, because it standardizes the results, so we can compare samples of different size. So the 79 uses of the word day in Mankiewicz in his 40,000 word sample, it comes to 0.198%. And again, remember, percent means out of 100. So he uses it 0.198 times per 100 words. And Wells is obviously even smaller because he uses the word day 23 times in his 40,000 word sample. So it becomes a very small percentage of 0.058. Okay, so now I look at Citizen Kane and I found the word day 60 times.
Right.
But 60 times in a sample size of 26,000 words. So we can't make any direct comparison with raw figures. We have to convert it to a percentage. And the percentage then is 0.232%. Now, another thing here is to keep talking about these very small numbers can be very tedious. But as I said, I'm talking about a percent, so per 100. And if we want to stop talking about 0.0 whatever, we can actually sort of scale them up. So rather than per 100, we can say, per 1,000. So the 79 uses of the word day in Mankiewicz becomes, 1.98 per 1,000. But even that's a bit awkward. So why don't we just keep scaling it up and go to 100,000? So we scale it up to 100,000. So we get Mankiewicz using the word day 198 times per 100,000 words. Wells is 58 times per 100,000 words. And Citizen Kane, it is 232 times per 100,000 words. Now, just quoting those figures, you can see that Citizen Kane is higher than Mankiewicz and Wells. But Citizen Kane is much closer to Mankiewicz than it is to Wells. Citizen Kane, 232, is very close to Mankiewicz is 198, and Wells is all the way down to 58. But obviously, quantifying it that way isn't enough as well. That's very informal. So what we do is we actually do what we did earlier with the, we just use the ratio again. We just divide one into the other. When we looked at relative frequency, I just divided 79 into 40,000, and we got the percentage. So we can do this again. We just divide Mankiewicz's frequency into Citizen Kane and Wells's frequency into Citizen Kane. So the Citizen Kane frequency is 232. The Mankiewicz is 198. Divide one into the other. That's all you have to do.
Mm.
and you end up with 1.17, which is as a ratio. Then do the same with Wells, and again, obviously put them in the same order. So 232 divide by 58, and you get 4. Now, if you had a ratio, if that figure came out as 1, it would be identical. You would say that these two samples are identical. So Citizen Kane has 232 per 100,000 words. Now, if the sample I was comparing it to also had 232, that would give you, you divide one into the other. It's obviously 232 divided into 232, you get 1. And so a ratio of 1 would suggest identity, complete identity between the two samples. So obviously you don't get complete identity here, but 1.17 is pretty close. That's the Mankiewicz. But Wells is 4. That's completely different. Basically, what that means is that Citizen Kane, there are 4 times more uses of the word day than there are in Wells. And in Mankiewicz, there's 1.17 or more or less in terms of Citizen Kane.
Could it be argued that, I can think of several objections here, and I'm assuming that what you're doing is you're doing this over and over again with lots and lots of different things, and so that
you can't do this with one word. I'm just giving one word as an example. So I do 44 words, and those 44 words, and then I average out all of these ratios, and then you get a final ratio. And so that's how you work. That's how you work it out.
So what are your conclusions then?
Well, I just point out that then in the next chapter, I then visualize this by putting it onto a confidence interval.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. You chose to hit play on this podcast today. Smart choice. Make another smart choice with Auto Quote Explorer to compare rates from multiple car insurance companies all at once. Try it at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.
I won't go into that. It would get more complicated. But so I actually create these graphs. But you can imagine a graph where one, again, it's if you reach the ratio of 1, that means identity. So you just plot Mankiewicz and Wells on this graph. And so for the word day, Mankiewicz would be very close to that 1, and Wells would be all the way up at the top of the graph. So the closer you get to that ratio of 1, the closer the authorship. As I said, I did that for 44 words and, combined all the different ratios. And I ended up, as I said, I did this 3 times. And I just talk about the 13 scenes version. And what I discovered a certain pattern there that, Orson Welles's statistical linguistic profile is dominant in 4 out of those 13 scenes. And those 4 scenes, one of them is very problematic, but it's the first 3 scenes of the film. So the prologue, News on the March, and then the scene after it in the projection room. And then after the projection room scene, the film then moves into Thompson going to interview everybody. And that's where the stylistic signature changes dramatically, where Mankiewicz, his signature suddenly becomes much more dominant in the screenplay. Now, Wells' signature becomes dominant in the last scene as well, when Thompson is summarizing Kane's life. They're in the basement and they're looking at all this stuff in the basement. And Thompson gives this speech about, how to sum up somebody's life. Well, that's where Orson Welles' signature reappears. So the prologue scene, is written in a very literary manner, and there's one word of dialogue, of course, just Rosebud, but it was written as almost of it as a novel, and there's absolutely no trace of Mankiewicz in there at all. So Welles clearly wrote that. Now people will say, okay, that's in the first draft of the screenplay, but Welles and Mankiewicz met before Mankiewicz started to write the first draft. And I imagine that Welles then, wrote this prologue and said, well, this is how it's going to begin. And then we're going to have a news on the march. And then they'll be in the projection room. And basically then he gives Mankiewicz instructions then to write the rest of the screenplay, but except for the summary right at the end of the film. So as I said, I charted all these frequencies on the graph. So all the frequencies are close to Welles in scenes 1, 2, and 3, and 13. And then he suddenly veers off when we get to the main part of the screenplay. Now, there obviously are variations. There are very small variations. When Thompson is interviewing Leyland in this nursing home, there's a little blip on the graph which suggests that Welles actually wanted to intervene here and wanted to make sure that this was right. It's actually a very comical scene where Leyland is avoiding all of Thompson's questions and says, can you get me some cigars? Put them in, disguise them and try to sneak them in. And while Thompson is trying to ask him about Kane, and I think all of that humour, then sort of an indication of Welles actually intervening to say we need to, because that's the key. One of the key to the films actually is that relationship between Kane and Leyland, and Welles really wanted to get that right. So I imagine he strongly edited those moments.
Okay, let me play devil's advocate then. One of I know that this sort of statistical analysis has been used on things like Shakespeare's plays to establish authorship, and especially things like Macbeth. Various parts of Macbeth have now been included in Thomas Middleton's collected works because analysis has proved quite decisively that there are whole scenes that Thomas Middleton wrote. However, with Shakespeare, all we have are the plays. We don't have the performances. Instead, with Citizen Kane, we have the film. So the argument of authorship, the text doesn't have the relationship to us as it does with Shakespeare's plays. So couldn't it be argued that authorship is not necessarily located in the screenplay, albeit seventh draft, but is located on the screen?
Well, firstly, with the Shakespeare, it's there's a lot of documentation that Shakespeare, like many other playwrights, co-authored screenplays, plays, because they were very busy. Exactly, the same thing happened with Citizen Kane. Shakespeare was didn't have time to write a whole play, so he collaborated with others. And the collaboration comes down to the fact that, Shakespeare say, well, you write these scenes and I write the other scenes, and we won't edit each other's work. So that's why you can detect authorship, multiple authorship in Shakespeare's plays, especially the late ones. We're talking about the late, there is a very famous book that's dealt with this by Brian Vickers called Shakespeare Co-Authorship. It's a 500-page volume, and I used it as one of my main texts because Shakespeare co-author. So and he uses some statistical analysis there, and he's a renowned Shakespeare scholar. And obviously with Citizen Kane, Welles was at RKO and developing these projects, and none of them were working. So his I think it was, he's on he's there for almost a year, and he hadn't made a film. So he's starting to panic because he wasn't fulfilling his contract. So he came up with, well, I'd have to hire somebody to help me write a screenplay in order to, fulfill the RKO contract. So then he started his collaboration with Mankiewicz. So obviously Wells would, control, the tone of the film by saying, well, here are the opening scenes. As I said, one of them is problematic. The News on the March is very problematic. It looks like Wells, but we have documentation that, of course, John Houseman said that he wrote it several times. But at the same time, it's imitating the voiceover of News on the March. It's just perhaps it's just a genre thing, and just a coincidence. Yeah, and it just sounds like Wells's dialogue. Wells's fingerprint. But anyway, that's what I think happened when they met before Mankiewicz started writing, is that Wells set up the whole project. So here's the prologue and here's the opening scenes, and this is how it has to end with this final scene. And then Mankiewicz was then tasked with writing the main scenes, which of course were then heavily edited by Wells, by cutting a lot of material. But of course, if you cut material, that your authorial signature doesn't suddenly appear, you see. That's the problem. That's one of the objections with, Wells did a great deal of creative work by editing and cutting and revising someone else's writing, but the original author's signature is still there. And to get back to your question, that yes, Wells is an auteur in terms of filmmaking, but we're treating the screenplay as a separate entity, as a text. So we're looking at the screenplay in itself as a text to analyze. So obviously Wells did excel in terms of directing, but several of his biographers say that's where he really excelled, but he didn't really excel when it came to writing. That's the more tedious part of creativity. It also goes back to the War of the Worlds, radio play. It's actually adapted by somebody else and who wrote it, and actually, it did go to court. Wells lost because the text was written by was it Koch, who he's hired to write the text, but the reason why everybody panicked is because the way it was staged by Orson Welles in the radio studio. But when you look at the text, it was written by somebody else who's of course adapting another text. So that's the issue. Where do you locate authorship? Wells worked on radio for several years, but every one of them was an adaptation. One of his first adaptations was Victor Hugo, Les Miserables, but a huge novel, and his main job was to cut it, just cut out these snippets. So literally, he would cut them out and paste them onto the screenplay. He didn't even write them out; he just cut and paste the bits that he wanted in the screenplay. So he was very good at editing text. But of course, there's no stylistic signature in that. It could be thematic. He picked particular moments, but in terms of language and style, his signature isn't there.
Well, he did it as a teenager. He was cutting when he was at Todd's Academy for Boys. He was cutting all of Shakespeare's history plays into a King's cycle, which is like absolutely, the gall of the man. I mean, at least he wasn't claiming authorship, but he was.
Editing Shakespeare is was still a teen.
And then he comes back with Chimes of Midnight, perhaps one of the best Shakespeare plays ever put to cinema, which is continuing that process of just chopping up Shakespeare's plays and putting his favorite bits together. as much an interpretation as it is a thing. So, I mean, in a way, I guess I come back to the answer is to the question is yes. Victor Hugo wrote the novel on which he based the radio play. Yes, this other writer wrote the radio script from which it was based. Yes, Herman Mankiewicz co-wrote the screenplay. I mean, that isn't necessarily even controversial. It's on the screen. But the authorship of the film, I mean, you could argue it's a three-hander. You know, Greg Toland shares the title card with the director, which is extraordinary at the time, that the director would share a title card with the director of photography.
Yeah, it's a different research question. Yeah, it's treating the screenplay as as an entity in itself rather than with the finished film. It's something that's developed recently of screenplay studies. It's not how to write a screenplay, but using the screenplay as an object of study and then promoting the writer within film studies rather than always focusing on the director.
Does that extend to like unmade screenplays as well?
Yeah, one of my samples is actually an unmade screenplay, but which is even better. One of Mankiewicz's screenplay that I used for like 40,000 word sample. It wasn't even made into a film, but that means it wasn't edited by anyone. So he wrote the screenplay, and then they said, "Well, we can't make this," so it didn't go through a production process, didn't go through rewrite. So it's more authentically his. So same with a Wells film screenplay, the Big Brass Ring. So it's obviously it was made later by somebody else, but the way he wrote it, it's a text that nobody else edited.
I think it's fascinating, actually. I remember talking to Charles Eldon, I think it was last year, about Michael Cimino, and Michael Cimino had a room in his house which was just to the floor to ceiling with written screenplays that he'd never stopped writing since Heaven's Gate, but just didn't have the opportunity to ever film. And the idea that I got was that the minute he died, they just all became worthless because there was no one's going to go in there and go through those screenplays and actually make a film out of them. It was just like, it was like, I guess it's a bigger version of what happens whenever anybody dies. Suddenly, all the stuff in their house just becomes, charity shop fodder.
To go back to this question of Wells's authorship, the Writers Guild of America, defines authorship of a screenplay in terms of, the first author must have written about 50% of it and so on. So, they measure authorship in terms of percentages as well. And indeed with copyright law, I had a fun time going through United States copyright law, trying to make sense of it. But in the end, they say it's not the ideas. You can't copyright ideas. You can only copyright the expression of ideas as manifest in a text. So this is why Wells lost the copyright legal challenge because he didn't write the text. He did something far more powerful, which was the staging of that for radio. But the writing of the text itself, he doesn't own the copyright on it.
So what does this as a research subject? How can you apply this to people's understanding? Is it just settling those questions once and for all, or in terms of the historical record, or how does it?
Yeah, if you think about what we do in arts and humanities, we just basically pick our favorite films and then write about them as if they are, the defining feature, the defining nature of cinema. Andre Bazin did this all the time, but we all do this to some extent. That all our work is really is completely inflected with confirmation bias. And obviously I've done this as well, but I get to a point where I say, well, do I want to now write another analysis proving that David Lynch makes puzzle films? And students do this as well. And I try to say, well, it's confirmation bias. It's a closed question, and you need to open yourself up to the fact that your question may have a different answer. So I'll just give an example that students do all the time. It's we do feminist analysis, and so a student says, I'm going to look at this film and prove that it's a patriarchal film. And obviously you say, well, you've already come to your conclusion, so what's the point? And if you state your conclusion like that, you said, well, all you're going to do is just cherry pick data and say, well, there we are, you see, I've proved my point. And I say to students, so it needs to be an open question. You say, okay, I'll take this film and ask, is it a patriarchal film or is it not? Or where is it is there some scenes patriarchal or not patriarchal? So it should be an open question. The way you approach it is then you say, okay, I'm going to use a particular theory and a particular method and apply that, and I will find out. I don't know what the answer will be. I will find out by applying a particular theory. And according to the principles of that theory, it will either be patriarchal or not. And then you can say, well, we'll use a different theory, and then we come to a different answer. So we avoid relativism by saying it can be anything you like, because it's always grounded in a particular theory and method. But and we're not saying it's universal. We're saying it's relative to that theory and method. If you follow the method, you will get a particular result. You can use a different method and you can get to a different result, and then you can compare them. The same with Citizen Kane. Basically, if you want me to put it bluntly, I don't care who wrote it. That really is, I don't care. I don't have any vested interest in promoting Orson Welles or Mankiewicz. Now, I know if I start, my results give Mankiewicz the edge. More of it was written by Mankiewicz than Wells, using my methods, and it's going to get me into trouble with Wells aficionados. If I said, oh yeah, it's almost all Wells, then there won't be any Mankiewicz supporters coming after me. Perhaps I guess David Fincher is sort of a supporter of Mankiewicz, but it's very much a minority. So yeah, my results are going to annoy a few, Wells, but I tell them, okay, you may have known Wells, but here's the actual results. He was a good storyteller. There's these famous stories about him in the 70s, sitting in the same restaurant, telling these stories about his past to everyone who came to his dinner table. And he's a great storyteller. But if you think about it in legal terms, in court of law, it's you need the evidence, not just great stories.
About that, in terms of the writing, Wells often used dictation as part of his writing. Does that in any way influence your results?
No, somebody did a study of Henry James. Henry James, he developed a cramp in his hands, and for the last few of his novels, he actually dictated them as well. And if Henry James, you imagine his incredibly long, complex sentences, you think, well, if he's no longer writing it but dictating it, they must have changed. And so someone did a very careful study of before he hired, before he hired a stenographer and afterwards, and there's absolutely no difference. That's partly due to the remarkable nature of, Henry James is right, that those complex sentences were in his head and he could dictate them. That's absolutely, unusual. I guess it's unusual for him, so it's a special case. But yeah, he did dictate his later novels, and there's no stylistic difference between them. You can't tell that there's a difference. But, Mankiewicz was doing the same. We see it in the film Mank. He's a got a broken leg and he can't do very much. So he's dictator. Yeah, obviously we know that it was such a long, prolix draft that he produced, and it had to be very carefully edited out. But again, if you edit someone's work, that your stylistic signature still doesn't appear.
Okay, well, that's fascinating. I mean, I hope it's definitely going to contribute to the argument. I don't necessarily think it's going to stop the argument definitively, but it will contribute and make us all regard it in a way which is a bit more refreshingly objective. I agree with your idea of the confirmation bias being not altogether helpful in this case. One last question, Warren. Do you have a film book that you'd like to recommend to our listeners?
Well, if they want to be challenged, earlier I talked about Thomas Alsace's work on the Mind Game film. Thomas unfortunately died quite suddenly in 2019, and he had this unfinished manuscript, which was on the Mind Game film. And so I decided, along with a few other colleagues, Dana Polin and Song Hoon and Thomas's widow, that we would finish this project for him. And this actually happened during the COVID lockdowns. Firstly, I was actually doing this Kane work at home during the COVID lockdown. It's actually a good time to sit down and relearn statistics and do all this incredible counting of words during lockdown, because I couldn't go out anyway. But the second thing I was doing was helping to edit Thomas's final book, the Mind Game film. We had this, the three editors, and then Sylvie, Thomas's widow. We had this email group, and we were literally emailing each other almost every day about Thomas's book, the Mind Game film. And we spent a year editing it, and then it was published. And it's a culmination of Thomas's thinking about the Mind Game film. And it's just such an overwhelming book anyway, but I would recommend that if, you really want a challenge. So, Thomas's posthumously published book, The Mind Game Film.
Brilliant.
Which that's my recommendation.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Warren. And thanks so much for taking your time to talk to us today.
Okay. Thanks.
If there's one thing that my family and friends know me for, it's being an amazing gift giver. I owe it all to Celebrations Passport from 1-800-Flowers.com, my one-stop shopping site that has amazing gifts for every occasion. With Celebrations Passport, I get free shipping on thousands of amazing gifts. And the more gifts I give, the more perks and rewards I earn. To learn more and take your gift giving to the next level, visit 1-800-Flowers.com/ACAST. That's 1-800-Flowers.com/ACAST.
Cue the fireplace and your favorite fall movie. There's nothing better than a cozy evening at home with a glass of First Leaf wine. First Leaf is a personalized wine club that delivers right to your door. Sounds magical, right? They get to know your favorite tasting notes, which varietals you enjoy, and whether you prefer sweet or dry wines. So in every shipment, you get bottles tailored to your unique palate. Go to tryfirstleaf.com/fall to get your first 6 wines for just $44.95 with free shipping.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.